Hey Untold Radio Network fans, want exclusive perks and to support our channel? Introducing our YouTube membership program with 3 amazing levels. Get loyalty badges that level up to different cryptids the longer you're a supporter. How cool is that? You'll also get access to custom Bigfoot emojis and priority in chat. Upgrade to Backstage Pass for exclusive wallpapers, photos, status updates, discounted books, and merchandise. Go all in with the producer level for everything mentioned plus member shoutouts. Ready for an enhanced experience? Join now, pick your membership level, and let's make this journey even more exciting together.
The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jen Durrell.
Good night, everybody, and welcome to Talking Weird on the Untold Radio Network. I'm your host, Dean Bertram, and I'm delighted that you can join us for the show tonight. The show that almost wasn't. Sometimes I do have internet problems. I live in the Northwoods, after all. A massive storm blew in this afternoon. The power was flickering. The phone went dead, which means the internet goes dead as well. And I thought, I'm going to be asking my co-host of Mysterious Library, Jason McLean, to jump in and do this one for me as he had to in a previous storm. But thankfully, no, I am here. And speaking of Jason McLean, who, if you don't watch Mysterious Library on Tuesday nights, you should. It's a great show. I have a bunch of fun talking to Jason. We have a bunch of fun with people in the chat as well. We just discuss books and movies and articles and things that you might find in a paranormal library, in a mysterious library. But tonight, for Talking Weird, our guest is a self-admitted superfan of the paranormal and the world of the weird. And you can catch him actually with Jason on another show of Jason's, Jason McLean Questions Everything. And you can also check out tonight's guest on his own show, Donny Cho Says Stuff, which is this hilarious, totally irreverent paranormal themed show. Anyway, I'm delighted to welcome back to Talking Weird because he was actually the guest the last time my power went down here and Jason had to step in. And that's the one and only Donny Cho.
Hi. Hello.
Thank you for
Thanks
being
for having me
here.
on.
Man, it's great to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
I'm
Yeah, this is my second time, first time with you.
Yeah, thankfully
Yeah.
Jason I actually messaged Jason when my internet and power was going up and down today and said, are you free tonight just in case? But thankfully we are here. I'm enjoying your new show, speaking about shows.
Yeah,
Can you talk a little bit about how that came into being? It's so much fun.
Well, I'd been doing a show for a little bit less than a year now with Jason on originally before he started doing his Jason McLean Questions Everything show. We were kind of simulcasting with Tex and Rob, Bigfoot Michigan Rob and Texas Front Porch for you folks at home. Just check it out. And yeah, we were, we've been doing this a while and just having a lot of fun together. And then throughout the course of that show, people just kept saying, hey, when are you going to do your own show? When are you going to do your own show? And then I said, okay, fine, I'll finally do it. But then when I said that out in public, I was like, oh my God, I actually have to do it now. Oh no. So then I just went ahead and did it.
As I mentioned in the introduction, it's very irreverent for the paranormal space. Like, it's funny as all get outs. But was that something you were like, I'm just going to do something which is fun?
Well, I kind of figured there's no paranormal comedy shows, right? Everything's so serious. Everything, because people want to maintain their, I guess, academic credibility or their, I don't know, social reputation, I guess, in this field. So people try to be serious. And, they do jokes. And people do laugh, but I wanted mine to be just silly, talk about paranormal topics as well, but also just have it be a lighthearted show.
Speaking of the paranormal, I think
Mhm.
because my first exposure to you was on the Texas Front Porch channel, and I
Yeah.
associate that with an awful lot of Bigfoot content. And of course, I do a show myself, Mysterious Library, with Jason McLean, and I know
Mhm.
he also does a lot of Bigfoot stuff. He does biblical stuff and UFOs and other things as well. But for whatever the reason, I assumed, obviously wrongly, that Bigfoot was your kind of gateway into this. And I was only watching one of your news shows the other day, and you
Yeah.
talked about your interest in psychic phenomenon and the paranormal being your gateway.
My first gateway into the paranormal was through ghosts. Actually, no. If I have to go, if I got to go a little bit further back, um, I think I'm a big, to my core, I am a big comic book, video game, wrestling nerd. That's what I am. That's what I've always been, right? But it's because of my interest in those things. I think it kind of set me up for my introduction into the paranormal world. My first exposure to ghosts as a phenomena and as a topic of research and interest for me was back in 2017, fairly late. But I think it was because it was particularly my fandom of video games made me interested in ghosts. Because in thinking about ghosts and psychics and that kind of phenomena, I started realizing, or I started thinking about, what if we're just characters in a video game? And what if the ghosts are like the glitches? And what if psychics are merely like the attribute points that your avatar has in a given game, right? So my predilections for video games kind of opened me up to being interested in the paranormal. Same as pro wrestling as well, you know. Uh, as a lifelong wrestling fan, I started to understand that I could watch something and simply enjoy something for what it is without being so caught up in its validity, right? Without being too caught up in whether or not it's real or fake. I could just enjoy it for what it is. And being a pro wrestling fan, it kind of trains you for that. You know, you're okay living in this space where you're not sure if it's real or if it's not. It's all everything's speculative. There's hearsay, but living in that in between zone, I think most people are uncomfortable. They want answers or they want to know that it's fake, right? Um, and I think you can kind of relate to yourself, Dean, because you're also were or are a wrestling fan as well.
Yeah, I certainly grew up a big wrestling fan, and then I came back to it in the Attitude Era with Stone Cold Steve Austin, and of course there was the Monday Night Wars with Nitro and the NWO, and it was an exciting period. It was an exciting period when I was a kid to be into it, when there was Hulk Hogan and Roddy
Yeah,
Piper and King Kong Bundy and Andre the Giant and all those larger than
me
life
too. Yeah.
characters. But then, of course, the Attitude Era was to me a relaunch of that incredible, amazing sensation of watching wrestling. Of course, by the Attitude Era, there was kind of an awareness that it was fake in throughout the fan base. I remember as a kid going to a wrestling match,
Yeah.
and I remember somebody there trying to insist it was real. You know, there were still people in the 80s who kind of held on to the idea that this was like a boxing type sport because they never came out themselves and talked about it being fake. But I think that's a really insightful point you make in regards to the paranormal, that when I assume most people consume paranormal television, they want to assume that what is happening is actually real, that these people are
Hmm.
capturing ghosts or having genuine experiences.
Yeah.
But I suspect a lot of it is no realer than professional wrestling. In fact, professional wrestling at least is super dangerous. I don't know. I mean, maybe some of this stuff's spiritually dangerous, but my point is there's a reality in wrestling when somebody jumps off the top rope, they might break their neck because this stuff
Yeah.
does happen. I'm not sure out there in the paranormal TV world what dangers there are. Again, there may be spiritual dangers, but do you think that'll happen in the broader paranormal community? I found it fun that you kind of talk of yourself as a super fan. Do you think fandom out there eventually will be I don't care if Ghost Adventures or whatever the big show is real or not. This is just fun. Do you think there'll be that tipping point?
I'm not sure because I've been to a few events and I've talked to a lot of people in this community. And one of the odd things or the peculiar things I've noticed about this group is that no one ever calls themselves a fan, right? They're into the paranormal. They think about it as a field of research or a way of, I guess, building up your social cred amongst people that you meet or whatever reason people get into. You rarely ever hear anyone say or call themselves a fan of the paranormal, right? No one ever calls himself like a Bigfoot fan. No one ever calls themselves like a UFO fan. But if you think about it, it's what they are. They're buying merch and going to conventions. I've seen people walking around with Bigfoot t-shirts.
Yeah. Instead of their Austin 316 t-shirt, they're wearing Bigfoot World Hide and Seek Champion or something t-shirt. Same thing. It's interesting though, because I know certainly when we were kids, we did backyard wrestling stuff because we were inspired by, you know, what we were seeing.
I did that.
So much fun. Not that you should do that at home, kids. But I wonder, that doesn't penetrate the broader wrestling community. I think what has penetrated the broader paranormal community with the popularity of paranormal television shows is this incredible growth in paranormal investigation groups and people who want to go out ghost hunting and people buying their own equipment. Like it does seem to have spread perhaps beyond just a consumer culture or just, you know, sitting back and watching it. It seems that it's triggered this great wave of participation, for better or worse. That seems to me to be a big part of the paranormal zeitgeist these days.
You can participate, right? As a wrestling fan, all you can really do is just go to an event or go watch TV and just watch. You can't really, with the paranormal, you can go on investigations. You can actually meet people. And, you know, I've gone on a number of paranormal investigations myself to some severely haunted locations, and I have my own stories as well, right? It's like, you know, you think about ghosts. I guess I would say I'm a fan of ghosts. So then one day I'm just like, you know what? I want to go and see one for myself. I want to go meet one. I want to encounter one. And you can do those things, right? Same thing with Bigfoot, right? There are people who go out into the woods looking for cryptids, right? They want to experience it firsthand. And even with UFOs, you hear about those people meeting up in the deserts, right? Holding hands, kumbaya, meditating, trying to summon UFOs. And
the C5 initiative people, Stephen Greer's people.
Yeah. Would you ever go to one of those, Dean?
No, I mean, I'll be honest. While I'm interested in the community, and I certainly have friends and associates in the community, I think my background as an academic doesn't mean that I don't believe, but I still always feel like an observer and a commentator more than somebody. I would go to something like that if I was writing a paper on it. Like when I was doing my PhD dissertation, I did go out with the Unarius Academy of Science to their landing spot outside of El Cajon in California, and where the sources are meant to come down. I watched the then leader of the group who's passed now, Charles Spiegel, channel an extraterrestrial and talk. I hung out with the Aetherius Academy when they were doing their chanting stuff and projecting energy into batteries, you know. So I spent time with those type of organizations, but as very clearly an academic, you know, observer rather than somebody who is a direct participant. I'm very reluctant to, and this is taking my academic hat off now, I'm very reluctant to try to communicate with something that I have no idea what it really is.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not sure if they really are ghosts. I don't think in fact, I doubt it's Great Aunt Edna's spirit, which is haunting the family mansion. I doubt it's really a hairy ape man running around the woods when I go out, if I went to go out tree knocking. I doubt it's really extraterrestrials in saucers if I'm out there meditating and flashing lights into the sky. So I don't know what you'd actually be triggering. I did have a friend who was years ago who was very much involved in the occult. And one thing he always said is be careful, you know, opening any doorways that you can't close. And I'm not saying whether he was smart doing what he did or not, but at least he had some understanding, perhaps more of the procedures than somebody who just goes, you know what, I watched Finding Bigfoot, I'm going to go knock on trees, or I watched Stephen Greer flashing at the sky, I'm going to do the same thing with flashing, I should say with a torch, not flashing in an inappropriate way. I've watched ghost adventurers when they go and get mad and yell at the ghosts and take the EVP meters, but I'm not sure what spiritual or occult or broader fundamental life experiences these people have that makes them safe to interact with something that calls itself whatever it is, whether it calls itself Aunt Edna or whether it pretends to be an ET or maybe it is. But regardless, this is kind of weird. Like, I wouldn't go out into a highway in the middle of the night and just try to engage with cars going past on on some deserted road. Who would want to do that? Just waving down random cars in the middle of the road in the middle of nowhere. That's the way you get taken, right?
Yeah.
Or who knows what's going to happen is my point. So I think that's the same for the paranormal. I think a lot of people are engaging in an active pursuit of the phenomenon. And I don't think, or the phenomena, depending whether you think of it as one thing with different faces or lots of different things. And I don't think any of them have any real. I'll rephrase it. I don't think many of them are taking into consideration the potential dangers that they might incur by doing that.
Yeah.
Whether it's just psychological dangers or whether it's spiritual dangers or whether there's genuine physical dangers. It seems to me like to be a massive leap of faith to think that you know what you're communicating with.
Yeah, and some people, they just rush into these situations without even, I guess, thinking or considering the nature of that which they try, like you said, to communicate with, and not even considering the possibilities of all the ways it could affect people too. Because I've seen people, like, I've been on investigations where I've seen people investigate, like when they investigate, they try to challenge it in a very disrespectful manner. I've seen that a few times, and in both of those cases, it didn't work out so well for that individual. So, I mean, when I went, I was just there just to really meet people. You know, I wanted to see what it was like, to meet other people in this paranormal community. I was more interested in reading them than encountering anything with a ghost. If anything, I didn't want to meet a ghost because I was like, that sounds scary.
That's something we should touch on a little bit as well, because I know you have in some of your show.
Mhm.
What are the differences culturally as far as the way Americans or Westerners approach the paranormal and approach these things and their engagements with it compared to Asian cultures?
What I've been seeing lately is that there is a budding paranormal scene going on in places like Asia, like China, Korea, Japan, like in Thailand and in Malaysia, like a lot of Southeast Asian countries. You're seeing a lot more grassroots movements. The way I would compare it, I would say the paranormal community in Asia is kind of like how it was in America, but back in the 70s. It was a lot. I mean, you know how it was in the 70s, right? How the scene was. What was the name of that couple? The Warrens. You had them. They were kind of like the forefront. You had some people who would go to investigate, but it was all very grassroots. It's not nearly as established as it is here, but I do notice there is a trend of people, for example, lately, there have been more and more people going into like abandoned hospitals because they'll be watching some shows over here and they'll be noticing that people talk about exploring abandoned hospitals. They tend to always be haunted for some reason. I wonder why, right? So then you're seeing a lot more and more Asian people, not a whole bunch, right? But there are some people on the internet that are going out investigating these places. Also, horror genre is a very big deal over there. So it is something that's very much in their zeitgeist, not in the same way as it is here. Not to that degree, but it is starting. I would say, yeah, it's like how the paranormal scene was here back in the 70s.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Funnily enough, one of our regular viewers, listeners, and also a regular guest on the show, Ed Schultz, who is just now completing a book on his reminiscences in the psychic world of both the 70s and earlier and after. He was he was a priest. He used to be known as the psychic priest, and he was an exorcist for Ed and Lorraine Warren.
Whoa.
So he was there at that grassroots type, time where it wasn't perhaps, well, there were shows, I suppose, like, In Search Of and the like. It wasn't there wasn't like there were whole cable channels just dedicated.
Right. It was like a
presenting
show
this.
that would deal with different topics, right?
Yeah, and it
I
seemed to
love that
present.
show, by the way.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's so good, and it presented people like
fantastic,
Hans Holzer or the Warrens or whoever, the type of popular culture we did anyway. But they always seemed to be really serious, and they were demonologists, and they seemed to have a very firm background, whether they were or not. It's certainly the way they were presented. But if you watch a paranormal show today, and sure, they can be fun, but it can be a group of 20-somethings running around with cameras, squealing in the dark. It's kind of there's not the same gravitas that watching Hans Holzer or watching the Warrens go, on an investigation back in the day.
I think the paranormal scene nowadays, in a lot of ways, it reminds me of the spiritual movement. We talked about this off air one time. It reminds me a lot of the spiritual movement in America back in the 19th century.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
a good point.
back during like the Civil War era, because back then there weren't too many forms of like public entertainment. It was basically you either went to a play or like some kind of like stage performance, but then they had a lot of these stage shows where you would have some kind of spiritualist, right? That's what they called them before they came up with the word psychic or paranormal investigator. They were all known as spiritualists. And these people would do stage shows where some of the upper echelon of society would show up, take a seat, and it was basically like a live podcast or like a speech at a convention, like a Bigfoot convention. You have those speakers, right? That's what they did. And that was a very common form, very popular form of entertainment back in America during the Civil War era. And people don't really mention that.
That's a good point. And all the table tapping and seances and, all of that stuff
Seances.
following the Civil War, because so many
Yeah.
people lost brothers and fathers and husbands and children. So this desire to be able to reach out and touch the deceased, I think, drove the popularity of an awful lot of that movement as well. Horace asked an interesting question that might know the answer to, and I don't, Donny, and that is, are US paranormal TV programs distributed to other countries with proper dubbing?
I can only speak on Korea. I would say no. I have seen a few paranormal shows, like, oh, thank you, Space Czar. Anyway, I have seen a few paranormal shows where it's like an episode or a TV special, right? Kind of like that Leonard Nimoy show. Yeah, I like it.
I didn't actually mean to put that up. I thought you.
Oh no, I like it.
So
I
I
like
clicked
it.
on it and I was like, oh.
No. I get more uncomfortable when people praise me, or like when people compliment me. That's when I feel a little icky. So,
well, no,
Oh,
I
no, it's
think
fine.
one of the
Yeah.
things I like about you, Donny, is that you march to a different beat to the standard, paranormal kind of assumptions. I just find you very insightful. It's the reason I had you on the show.
Well, thank
But-
you.
But no, it's true. I think it's interesting. We were talking about horror before and wrestling and those popular culture
Mhm.
connections to the paranormal. And it was something I was only thinking about the other day. I was watching the new Small Town Monsters documentary, the Dogman Triangle, and Jason and I we just reviewed it on Mysterious Library on Tuesday.
Mhm.
And I've heard them say it before, but both Ken Gerhard and Lyle Blackburn, and maybe I don't know if Nick Redfern said it, maybe, but certainly Ken Gerhard and Lyle Blackburn, who are two, seriously, fairly heavy hitters within this space, have talked about how their interest in monsters coalesced with their interest in cryptozoology. So they already loved things like the Universal Monster movies or
Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
and then that there was talk about Bigfoot being out. In the North American woods, there was a real monster there then. So it is interesting that sometimes our popular cultural interests, which seem to be separate from the paranormal, somehow coalesce, and maybe somebody who is interested in horror might like Japanese horror ghost movies or something.
Mhm.
Then maybe I know it's the truth, because a lot of people who come to the film festival I run, Midwest Weird Fest in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, are just as interested to see a paranormal documentary as they are to see a horror movie. Like, there's a definite crossover in a lot of this taste in the supernatural and the unusual and the weird.
I've noticed that too, especially in the paranormal ghost side of things. You see a lot of people who are also like very, very much into the horror genre. Here's the thing: I got into ghosts first, but I was never much of a fan of horror movies. I was just more interested in the I guess the metaphysical or the philosophical implications of ghosts actually being a real thing, right? Like, if ghosts are real, then what does that say about the afterlife or the human soul? Those were the questions that I was interested in. So that's why I got into it, and that's why I kind of got interested in the idea of psychics, because that is showing like a form of human potential, right? Like, we all have this potential to have these spiritual or supernatural abilities, And I can actually go out and meet some of these people and befriend some of them and have conversations with them, right? Of all the different paranormal phenomena in this field, right? Bigfoot, ghosts, UFOs, aliens, or whatever. Psychics are the only ones you can actually take out to lunch and actually sit down and have a beer with, you know?
Hmm. And I think you said that you tend to think that most psychics are genuine. I mean, they might have an off day, but you seem to have a degree
I
of belief that
automatically
most aren't
assume.
fooling people.
Yeah, I automatically assume. Not because I'm gullible, but because well, again, I think everyone's got abilities, right? And also, if someone's going to claim that they're psychic, yeah, they could be doing it to try to trick people into giving them a lot more credit than they probably deserve. But also, it's also kind of scary to kind of put yourself out there and admit something like that about yourself to public. And I cannot assume that people are of either intention either way until I actually get to know them, right? Um, but again, the last episode I did that you started watching, one of the things I started talking about was how I guess people get a little too caught up in the definition, or perhaps their definition of what a psychic could potentially be is too narrow. Because the argument I made is in that show was that a sense of humor is a form of psychic ability. I think it's the most underrated, overlooked psychic abilities there is.
That's interesting. Certainly a sense of empathy, I think, might fall into that as well. The idea of how to read a room or how,
Mhm.
somebody's uncomfortable or I mean, I don't think of myself as psychic, but I think I always have a pretty good sense of how people are feeling, and that might
Yeah.
just be an ability to pick up on visual cues or something, but it's not like I ever read anybody's mind, but I often think, "Okay, that person, I'm pretty sure they're not comfortable here, or that person seems to be having a good time." And maybe I'm fooling myself, but there might be some things that we think of as supernatural, but maybe it's just us reading visual cues or hormone scent cues,
Hmm.
which we're not even conscious of. So I find it interesting that you were mentioning you think that most people have psychic powers, and you yourself were then talking about one psychic power, a type of sense of humor, perhaps to be able to use to make somebody, I suppose, more at ease or something. But what things
Well,
which
here's the
finish
thing
that
that
thought then
he,
first.
with regards to sense of humor, it's like the way I see it, you can impose your will on someone and forcefully make them burst with happiness and joy, even if it's against their will. That's the potential of humor, right? That's why I think humor is probably one of the most powerful psychic abilities there is. And I've heard stand-up comedians talk about it, like when they're on fire, right? When they're in a comedy room. I mean, you've gone to a live stand-up shows, right?
Sure.
Yeah. There's like a weird energy in the room where you feel compelled to laugh, even though it's not even a joke that you normally feel like would be all that funny if you heard it from somewhere else.
I think that might be like stage hypnotism as well, to be
Yeah.
honest. In fact, Ed Schultz is also a stage hypnotist, amongst other things. I think Ed has suggested something along those lines that our desire to please or our desire to go along makes stage hypnotism work more than actually the fact that it, does some weird mental power to you. It's just you want to
Yeah.
comply with the situation, the same way you want to laugh in a comedy club, perhaps.
Now, another way that I kind of started seeing what psychic probably is, it's not some kind of inherent weird function of your brain's biology that allows you to perceive extra dimensions, because maybe it's more akin to being fluent in a language. Okay, so what I mean is synchronicity, right? We know what that is, and when an event like a synchronicity event occurs, most people, for everyone, there's going to be three options, right? You either ignore it, you consider it, but then you conclude that it's a coincidence, or you see it as a moment of synchronicity, or perhaps even an act of God, right? How you choose to perceive that event, that is kind of part of the language I think a lot of these psychics use to draw some of their conclusions. So what a psychic could be at the end of the day is someone who chooses to perceive everything as a synchronicity and then uses those synchronicity events as a kind of symbol to inform some kind of language. Because I talked to one friend of mine who's a remote viewer, and I asked her how she did it. And she pretty much described it in those terms, right? It's not like she gets into some meditative trance and the image appears in her head. She is looking around a room. She is finding patterns where people normally wouldn't notice them, and she's interpreting it as a symbol. She's charting it, she's graphing it, and she calls it data. To her, psychic abilities is more really not really ability, but more of like, I guess, proficiency in the language.
Yeah, it's I've done remote viewing experiments again with Ed Schultz on the show because that's something else you can do. But one day we were chatting. I'm trying to, if you can remind me, Ed, you're in the chat. I don't think we were even chatting. No, we were chatting on the phone. And wherever Ed was, he was like, "I want to run a remote viewing experiment on you," but in the reverse, you know. And as soon as he said it, I knew what I was meant to do before he started talking me through even the process. And instantly I had this very strong impression of a Western, like cowboy Western stuff, you know, like horses and cowboys and all of this stuff. And that's what I said. I have this Western impression. And then Ed uses a more sophisticated protocol. And then my conscious mind was obviously trying to work out what could I have been seeing. So I was thinking maybe I was seeing a Western painting with horses. And so I'm going like horses, and you know, I was adding all of these kind of other things to it. But ultimately, I told him, I'm not sure. All I know is the first thing I had was an impression of a Western. That's what was instantly in my head, the second you started the narrative. And sure enough, he sent me a photo of what he was looking at. And it was a wall with cowboy hats and old-fashioned Western era guns on them.
Whoa.
Yeah, and I've never tried any other remote viewing experiment. That was the only time, and I was like, to me, that was like a hit out of the park. And that was without even following a protocol. As soon as Ed said it, for some reason, my subconscious just dropped. This went boop, and that was what I saw straight away: Western imagery, and that type of Western imagery. You know,
So it just kind of came into it was like as
straight
if it
away.
was
It was like
zapped in your head.
very quickly, boom. And then when I tried to follow the protocol more, I got my conscious mind obviously overrode any type of instinct. And I was trying to think, what could I have been, you know what I mean? And trying to put together other things. But initially, just the pure initial thought was like, just to me, like a perfect hit. And I've never done it before, and I've never done it since. So,
Man, that must have been an experience. Wow. I remember I mean, I remember like there were I was in Korea, and so when I was living in Korea, I was one of those guys that was really into like proving the fake martial artists, right? I was really all about you remember for a while there were those people that in China that were like these MMA guys who would get into fights with like these kung fu tai chi masters, and then they would beat up the kung fu guy and they put it all over the internet, right? Because a lot of these people in these really traditional martial arts don't really know what they're doing in an actual fight, right? And so I was telling this to one of my professor buddies when I was teaching at a university. He was actually a professor of Oriental medicine, you know, and he's listening to me give these opinions about these martial arts. And he's like, well, what do you think about like all the Oriental medicine? And I'm like, yeah, you know, some of it could work. Herbs have been known to work, but I think like acupuncture, that's all just baloney, right? So he's like, okay, well, let me show you. So he takes me into his office, and he takes out the acupuncture needles, right? This guy's a professor of acupuncture, and he's like, he has me put my arm on the table. He sticks one of the needles in my arm, and he's like, go ahead, move your arm. My arm was frozen solid like a rock. I couldn't move my fingers. I couldn't lift it from the table. It was just one acupuncture needle in the middle of my forearm, and the whole thing was just, it was like frozen solid. And I was so prepared to just dismiss it, right? I was arguing against it. I thought it was just all just nonsense. But then when he took out the needle, it was like my arm just kind of went back to being normal again. I was like, how did you do that? Can you do it again? He did it again.
Gosh.
Right? It's those kinds of experiences, man. It's those kinds of experiences that make you really question stuff.
Yeah,
And I'm glad you got to have that experience, because I don't know. How did you feel? How did you feel when you found out that he was looking at that stuff? Was it like were you like shocked? Were you like, huh?
I obviously it was a wonderful vindication to have had that feeling and then to have
Yeah.
seen the photo sent to me afterwards. I didn't dwell on it. I didn't think about it as much as perhaps one would. I didn't think now I'm going to become a remote viewer or try to do this more often.
Yeah.
And I wonder if in life that often happens to people. I wonder if some people I think have an experience and it can change them forever and they can go on a different path. But I think most of us probably have these encounters which can't be rationally explained by today's, paradigms. And then we probably just because we've got the bills to pay and the children to feed and the lawns to mow or whatever else, we just move
Real
on,
life
right?
catches up with us. Yeah. Taxes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bills.
And I think that often happens if you're in this space, as you and I are, I will have people who never would have come out to me and said, I've had this experience, or, I'm interested in this. And when they know you do a show, and it's not like thousands or millions of people watch this show, but enough people watch or are aware that I do it because they've seen me do it on Facebook and they're on a friends list, or they've heard somebody else at a party talk about it or something.
Mhm.
And then people you never would have thought will come to you and say, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I know you're into this stuff. And then they tell you it and you're like, it doesn't sound crazy, and often they'll tell you things which had a profound impact on them. Sometimes it's just that they're interested in stuff that you had no idea that they were also interested in ghosts or UFOs or Bigfoot, and they never appeared to be that person and never engaged socially in it or ever talked about it. But
Yeah.
sometimes they'll have some genuinely life-changing paranormal story to tell you, like something which is clearly, when I say life-changing, I mean, it's clearly really dug into their subconscious and hasn't let them go.
Yeah. Do you feel like interest in the paranormal is growing amongst like just the average person these days?
I think there's a kind of a return to, like you were saying before, not that it's the same, zeitgeist as the 70s, but certainly there's a growth in it again. I remember as a kid, it seemed to be everywhere. Like there'd be
Really?
horoscopes sold everywhere, and there'd be shows like In Search Of on prime time, and there'd be Chariots of the Gods at the movies, and there was films like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And it seemed to me that the 70s was this, and the 70s into the early 80s, there was this kind of, real awareness and interest in the occult, even pop songs of the day. Like when you think about stuff from Bowie or stuff from Styx or stuff from the Carpenters, there's all these songs which are in the charts, which are about contact with ETs and all this other weird stuff. And I do think it seemed to perhaps then, dissipate. Perhaps the same way we were talking about those post-Civil War years in the late 19th, early 20th century,
Yeah.
how there was so much of this interest in spiritualism. Maybe it comes in waves. I certainly think there's more interest today than there was 20 years ago.
I definitely notice it's easier to talk about, to breach this topic with like a regular random person that you would meet, like for example at a party or at the workspace. You're a lot more, I mean, as opposed to like, I don't know, a few generations ago, where if you even bring it up, people will start looking at you funny.
Yeah, I do think and that's because of cable television probably, and because of the preponderance of, I don't even know the names of them, I don't watch that many, but ghost adventure type shows, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's so many of those shows out there now. And maybe there's something happening the same way I think in the 70s there was that occult explosion, late 60s through the 70s. And you can rewind it, as some historians do, even to the contactee period. You can even look at the 50s, that being the beginning of this occult explosion, and it really only detonating in the 70s. But perhaps it's when there's times of social unrest, when there's times of social uncertainty, the same way there was in the late 60s into the 70s, maybe people look for deeper meaning. And in a world which is probably increasingly unchurched in the traditional way. People want to find meaning, so they look to other forms of esotericism or other forms of supernatural belief that can fill those gaps that they mightn't have been missing, in a more traditional culture.
So we all know that the field of paranormal research has been developing, right? It has been advancing. There are more discoveries, inventions that people come out with that aid them in finding out about, like spirit boxes, right? Like, when was that a thing? Uh,
Well, it still is
uh
in some circles, I guess.
yeah. I'm just wondering, as research advances, does our current generation or of the people in the paranormal community, do you think we have a more, I guess, educated understanding or a better understanding of this phenomena than the people back in the 70s and 80s?
I think it depends on the researcher and the investigator. That might be a slight cop-out, but I really think that it does. For example, if you looked at a John Keel back in
Uh-huh.
the 70s, or a Jacques Vallée or a Brad Steiger, or these people that at least Keel identified as the new ufology in his wonderful journal article on the subculture of flying saucers, which it's another show Jason and I did on Mysterious Library a couple of months back. It's worth going and listening to that. It's a wonderful article. I think it appeared in the Journal of Popular Culture in like 1975. I think Keel had written it in 72 or 73, and it took a while to get published. But then there were people, just to look at ufology for a moment, who were working out that the UFO phenomenon, or aspects of the UFO phenomenon, seemed to be related to other esoteric and occult traditions like fairy faith, like demonology, and that there was this cross pollination perhaps of ideas which weren't necessarily even recognized by somebody who
Hmm.
thought the space brothers from Venus were here to help us become more spiritually enlightened. Well, somebody might say, well, that's just a type of Eastern esotericism via the New Age, and you've got, just a UFO version. But there were certainly people in the UFO community who I think then thought they'd cracked it in a way. They thought they'd realized that it's more sophisticated than nuts and bolts and sources and aliens from distant worlds. This says something about us psychologically and sociologically. The way that the Jacques Vallée character, or the character based in Jacques Vallée in Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, played by
Hmm.
Francois Truffaut, the French director, the character's name is Lacombe, it's essentially Vallée, says this is a sociological phenomenon. I think there was this idea that this had a lot to do with who we were as people, at least, or who we are as a culture, who we are spiritually. But then that tended to fall away after the 70s. I think in some ways there are researchers, and ironically, even at the end of Close Encounters, it all falls away, because at the end of Close Encounters, it's a physical nuts and bolts mothership with the
Oh yeah,
aliens come out of it,
yeah, and they
right? So
all come out.
there's some irony there, that there's a guy who's very much based on Vallée, and Vallée didn't like that ending. I don't like that ending of the movie. I think when it's more mysterious and you're not sure what the phenomenon is, Close Encounters is a much better film. But anyway, so I think there were people in the 70s who were aware that this was more complicated than just your standard science fiction type version. I think today there's a return to some people who are thinking like that as well. We've done books by Joshua Cutchin. He's a great example. There are a number of thinkers in this space who are again looking at it, that there seems to be more going on here than just the surface level. But then there's an awful lot of people who still look at it the same way that they looked at it in the 1950s. Do you know what I mean? That these are just ETs from elsewhere, and the government knows all about it. And if they'll only tell us that we're right, we'll all be happy. And that's exactly what Donald Kehoe was writing in the early 1950s, right? The head of NICAP, in his
Yeah.
books, Flying Saucers Are Real. It's the same thing that people who are fighting for disclosure today say. Well, we know they're aliens and we know they're from elsewhere, and the government knows. Now we just want the government to tell us that we're right in this belief system. So there's no change in mainstream ufology. That doesn't mean that there aren't people, again, like Keel and Vallée, who are capable of looking at it in a different way. Now, as far as in the Bigfoot community, I think there's some movement there as well. I think there's people like Ron Moorhead. Again, Joshua Cutchin's written in that Bigfoot space, people like Jason McLean. There are people who there are also saying some of this seems to be indicative of something more complicated than just these flesh and blood man apes that we haven't been able to catch, even though we've been trying for some, 70 years.
I'm inclined to agree with that.
So is
Yeah.
that your feeling that so yeah, what's your takeaway anyway, as far as where we are and where it's different to where we've come from?
I think well, I can't help but wonder what it must have been like to be one of those researchers back in like the 70s where basically you are just researching by yourself, and maybe there's like one other guy you're contacting with, maybe writing letters or doing phone calls with, but you're not having regular conversations with large numbers of people on a regular basis. You're probably living in your town. Everyone else around you that probably doesn't even know what you're doing, and if they did, they'd probably think you were nuts. So these people probably lived very isolated existences, because the average Joe going to work and taking care of the kids and the bills, they don't have time to talk about that kind of stuff. So in that regard, I do think it's different, because nowadays, with YouTube and social media and everything, we can have regular conversations about these topics. Like, I can go into these chats and go on these shows and watch a deep conversation about the paranormal literally every night if I wanted to, and communicate on a regular basis. That aspect is new.
Good point.
Like, I don't.
The
Yeah.
substance is it? Do you think the substance of the communicate or the substance of the messages which are being traded back and forth are particularly different?
In terms of the substance, though, I think I can't say confidently that it's gotten better or worse, only because there are so many more people who have a voice. There are going to be so many other alternative ideas and just chatter and different viewpoints, right? You know, that Jacques Vallée, when he was first getting out there and doing his research, he didn't have to contend with like 20 other UFO researchers who all had their own opinions, right? And that's the thing I feel like we really deal with. And I don't think that that's really advancing nor hurting. I feel like it's just more crowded.
Yeah, there's a lot more noise to the
Yeah.
signal, perhaps. There still is a signal probably in there, but
Yeah.
mind you, there was always, I suppose, if you were embedded in the community while you didn't have that immediate access, you
Mhm.
still had things like Long John Nebel talk show back in the day, and then Art
Yeah.
Bell. You could still hear people, but you're right, you couldn't perhaps be quite as engaged or as involved as you are now. I wonder if all that's done though is create an ugly echo chamber where people who agree with each other cheer each other on, and people they don't agree with just get angry with each other. So
Well,
there isn't really an improvement in the level of communication. There's just more communication.
yeah, just more of it. Yeah, but I also don't want it to make it sound like I think that that's necessarily a bad thing either, because through that, you do network pretty well. You meet a lot of friends. It's got its good sides and its bad sides. I don't know if for example, our understanding of Bigfoot any better now today than it was maybe 20, 30 years ago? Do we know more about it now?
That's a good question. I think if you look at the material being written then, if you look at, say, a flesh and blood Bigfoot book, like something by, it's even longer ago than that. If you look at John Green's stuff or Rene DeHenden's stuff or Peter Burns' books, they were all saying similar things to most flesh and blood Bigfoot people are saying now. I suppose what those type of camp would call the woo camp. There was a book by Lauren Coleman and Jerome Clark, both when they were less immersed in the physical reality of either flying saucers or cryptids. And Jerome Clark and Lauren Coleman's book, what's the UFO? I think the UFO one's the unidentified, and their cryptid one or their Bigfoot one is Creatures from the Outer Edge or something. Both great books, both very
Yeah.
much within the John Keel, Jacques Vallée type space. So there were people still writing that type of messaging back there within the Bigfoot community. But it's not so much. I'm not as aware of the history of that literature in that community as I am of the UFO communities. I suspect there would have been people who were woo back then to a degree, but I suspect overwhelmingly the people who were interested in Bigfoot were flesh and blood. I still think
Yeah.
there's a majority of flesh and blood opinion, to be honest.
I'm sorry, because you're talking about like in the paranormal community. Do you think like amongst like people who are into cryptids, a lot more of them are of the flesh and blood camp?
I don't think there's more than there were in the 70s. I think there's probably more woo people now than in the 70s. But I
Yeah.
think if you still
Yeah.
lined up, if you went to a Bigfoot conference,
Uh-huh.
and there's probably different Bigfoot conferences as well. I don't know. I'm not in the community. There's probably ones which are more sympathetic to the woo, and there are some who are probably more sympathetic to the ape perspective. But I would think if you had everybody together and said a show of hands for who thinks Bigfoot's a physical, either ape man or relict hominid, I think you get more hands go up than if you said, and who thinks it's an ultra terrestrial from elsewhere, which just manifests as a Bigfoot when it's here and then disappears again. You get
Yeah.
some hands go up, but I don't think you'd get as many that would go up wanting it to be, flesh and blood. And I certainly think in the investigative community, the people out there knocking on trees and trying to capture it on video, it would all seem such a folly to even do that. If you accepted a Keelian ultra-terrestrial perspective, or if you accepted the old Jerome Clark, Lauren Coleman, Creatures on the Outer Edge, or whatever it was called perspective, it would seem almost nonsensical to want to go out there and knock on wood and, take casts of footprints. And it seems to be a very, when you take that route, it seems like you've put on the physical hat and you're thinking
Yeah.
it's going to be solved in some zoological way. So I suspect that still is the great underpinning of most of the Bigfoot community. But you're probably in it more. What do you think, Donnie?
Honestly, I think for a lot of these people who do it, I think it's just they want that adventure. They want the adventure of not just the adventure of meeting up with some friends one weekend, driving out, going out into the woods, right? Some of these people going armed. So it's pretty serious stuff. It's not like casual, but it's exhilarating because you get that sense of adventure, right? You're preparing for war. You're going with your friends who you trust, right? They're your brothers and your sisters in arms, practically. It's how these Bigfoot investigators see each other when they go out in groups, right? So in that regard, I get it because people oftentimes overlook the fact that in this paranormal community, just don't forget to have fun. Just have fun with it, right? I think a lot of these people are having fun, and there's something to be said for that. And I'm sure a lot of these people who go out into the field probably have it very well in their minds that they're probably not going to even find anything. But at the end of the day, they're still with their friends out in the woods, camping, sitting around a campfire, drinking beers. That sounds like fun to me. I don't know.
Sounds like fun to me as well.
Yeah.
And maybe that is the great appeal of all of this. You just have a community with people who kind of share your interests, just like you might if you had buddies who like to golf or to hunt or to, I don't know, go just plain camping without looking for Bigfoot. And you get to enjoy that experience with them. So that aspect of it is
And
like
that's
any other hobby, really.
that's what I wonder about, like investigators and researchers of like previous generations, like the 70s and 80s, 60s. I wonder if it was fun for them, like it is for some of us today. Like they had their group of friends that they can meet with and go out on investigations with, or were these like isolated writers and authors who, all hated all their neighbors because they were all normies,
Well, I think there was, I don't say elite being disparaging,
Yeah.
but I think there was a more elite aspect of, and I don't say it disparaging or say it, in a praising way. I just say it as I think that was almost the perspective of the people who were doing it, not thinking they were better than others, but this was a very specific thing that only some people did. Like
Mhm.
if you watch some of the old In Search ofs, I think it's the one with Peter Byrne and the Abominable Snowman. And he's like meeting in some English estate with other members of the Explorers Club or something,
Yeah.
and you can see this isn't the guy down the road from me now. Not that I actually know this person, but I know he exists hypothetically because I bumped into somebody in the Walmart car park who's probably very much like this hypothetical person with Sasquatch Hunter on the side of his thing. And, I've bumped into other people in bars around here with, Squatching t-shirts on. They're like, yeah, I was out there knocking on, the trees or whatever. So my point is, I don't think you did it so casually in the 70s. I
Yeah.
think it was, even if you were like a Patterson Gimlin, you were out there like, okay, we're going out there to try to film Bigfoot. This is a big deal. If you're Peter Byrne, you're getting expedition money to do it. If you're John Green, you're writing about it. It's what you're almost doing. I suppose it was part of his journalistic income. It seemed to be more defining as almost like a career, or almost as something you didn't just do as a hobby. Now, where there's the occasional kid who went, I'm going to go out into the woods and find Sasquatch, probably, but I don't think there were as many people who'd watched Finding Bigfoot who now went out with night vision cameras and knocking on trees, just like there weren't as many people who'd watched Ghost Adventurers, because neither of the shows existed, who were just casually going into houses with EVP meters and night vision cameras. So I do think that television culture of this stuff made it look like it was very doable to people. And also back in the 70s, while people were reporting Sasquatches probably not just in the Pacific Northwest, which is almost what most of the mainstream books made you think about back then, if you read something by somebody like Peter Burns, certainly, or John Green, certainly, they were being seen in other places. But I think today, people will literally just go to their nearby woods and walk in 5, 10, 15 minutes and think they're squatching. You used to go to the Pacific Northwest or the Himalayas or something, to look for these creatures and go on a serious journey.
I go squatching every night when I walk my dog, right?
You're just as likely to see one out there as anywhere, probably.
Yeah. So I guess for going back to, one of the reasons why I started my show was because, I was thinking about what we were just talking about. And I was like, man, for those researchers back then, they probably didn't have someone that could like just crack a Bigfoot joke or a ghost joke or a UFO joke. And I think that could be new. So that's why I guess I wanted to start my show as a paranormal comedy show, because again, people take this stuff awfully seriously, and they lose sight of the fact that this could be a lot of fun. Right?
Well, hopefully your show will make people realize that it can be a heck of a lot of fun.
Yeah.
What topics do we have? Sorry, you go.
Oh, I'm just saying, like, the investigations I went on, I had some experiences on my own, but you know what? At the end of the day, they were a whole lot of fun, and I got to meet a whole lot of new friends. So it was worth it.
What topics can we expect in the coming weeks from you? Have you got some mapped out already, or?
Yeah, it's not going to be all paranormal, but it's going to be. I am going to do like it's going to be pop culture stuff. Kind of alternate between that and some paranormal, and it's not going to be all comedy. There are some topics I actually do intend on tackling. I hopefully I can get you on one of these shows one day, Dean, and we can do some pro wrestling.
That'd be, as long as it's Attitude Era or like, original WWF, a circa WrestleMania 1, 2, 3 era, I'm down to talk about any of that stuff.
This coming Monday, I'm supposed to meet up with Jason, and we're going to record an episode for my show where we're just going to talk about all of our favorite movies when we were kids.
Oh, fun.
That's it. So it's a fun show. It's just me. It's just it's just my little hobby. So.
Well, your little hobby deserves a lot of success because your show is different to anything else out there. It's engaging, it's entertaining, and it's funny.
Yeah, I try to be. I don't always land, but I try.
You have a very dry sense of humor too, which I like. Yeah. It's fantastic. So how do people watch your show?
Just look me up on Donny Cho Says Stuff. I'm not on any specific time. I kind of just release videos whenever I feel like it. So just subscribe and turn on a notification. Hopefully YouTube will play nice and allow you to get those notifications. And I usually set them like whenever I film something, sometimes it'll be spur of the moment. It's all pre-recorded, by the way. It's not live because there is like mature language. So I'd have to be careful, especially when I have guests, if they, don't want to have it released, just give them that option. Also, I find it's actually a lot more interactive with the fans or people in the chat if you're actually in the chat while it's playing. I kind of like that. So just look up Donny Cho Says Stuff. Just subscribe, and I'll try to I try to release it like once a week or twice a week, usually on a Wednesday, and then sometimes on a weekend.
Excellent. I'm going to keep watching. And you're also on Jason McLean's other show, right?
I
Jason
am
McLean
also
Questions
a
Everything.
co-host to Jason McLean Questions Everything. I'm kind of he's the Conan O'Brien. I'm kind of the Andy Richter. So yeah, and we're on Wednesdays. The show premieres. Sometimes Jason will come out with some of his stuff on the weekends, and sometimes once a month or once every other week we'll do a live. And I think Mr. Dean, you're going to be having a few appearances there yourself.
I always love chatting to you guys. It's always a joy, whether you guys are on with me or I'm on with you, or Jason and I are on together every Tuesday night on the Untold Radio Network on Mysterious Library.
Oh, by the
9
way,
p.m. Central.
I highly recommend the show that Jason and I did on Star Wars. If you ever get the chance to listen to that, the latter half of that episode, Jason goes full unhinged nerd.
Oh, wow.
And it's a sight to behold.
I'm going to go check it out after this.
It's a sight to behold. We just talk about Star Wars the whole time.
I was such a Star Wars fan. I'm not going to go down the Star Wars path now, but as a kid, I had Star Wars wallpaper. I had Star Wars bedspreads. Like, I was Star Wars super fan. Now I can't even stomach watching a Star Wars movie. I'm just
Jason,
I can't stomach a Marvel movie anymore either. It's just also overdone. I want something new and different.
Yeah, they've kind of worn out their welcome, I feel like.
Well, we shouldn't wear out our welcome, Donny. You were a great guest. It was a great delight chatting to you. I'm going to keep watching your new show, and I can't wait to come and talk to you and Jason sometime in the very near future. So thanks so much for being on the show, man.
All right, thank you.
And until I chat to you next time, and everybody else out there, please keep it weird.